So the Sony A6700 was announced this past week, and it's been quite a while since we've seen a Sony APS-C camera come out, besides the Sony FX30, which is a little different because that's the base level of the Sony Cinema line now. But yeah, there hasn't been a Sony APS-C camera in the standard body style format in several years. And this release doesn't come as too much of a surprise. It's just more surprising as to how long it took. But I gotta say, based off of the specs, I didn't get a couple of things right, but I'm honestly not that impressed. I gotta say that the 4K 120 is pretty cool that they were able to include that in this little compact body, but I know that's already been featured on the ZV-E1, and I know I mentioned in a previous video that I didn't think they were going to include it because it seems like it might be more of a novelty feature. However, there are reports that people are getting up to about 13 minutes of 4K 120, and I think in most cases, I can't really think of another scenario where you would use 4K 120 for more than a couple of minutes at a time, considering it's mostly for B-roll. It's cool that they did introduce this into the APS-C line. However, I'm pretty surprised that they didn't include dual SD card slots. Now I know not everybody needs dual SD card slots. If you're just buying this camera for the incredible AI autofocus and you may already have some existing APS-C Sony glass, then this is still a great camera. But for $13.99, when you compare it to the competition in the APS-C realm, like the Canon R7, that camera, while it can't do 4K 120, does have dual SD card slots. It can shoot 4K 60. I personally think the R7 is the better camera in that price range. Now, I can't say for certain whether it's the better camera to purchase because Sony has a better lens lineup for the APS-C style bodies than Canon does. But that still doesn't mean that I won't critique the Sony A6700 because I do think Sony could have done a little bit more for this camera. It's not that far under the Sony FX30 in terms of price. It's a couple $100 less. I honestly think that if you're looking at picking this camera up, you might be better off just saving a couple $100 more and buying an FX30. But if you're on a budget and maybe you already have a Sony A7 IV or maybe even a Sony FX30 already, and you just want a backup APS-C camera that can shoot 10-bit video and it's not really your primary camera, then the Sony A6700 may be worth it to you. It is cool that they finally have 10-bit 4K video in the APS-C style bodies besides the FX30. But one big critique that I have about this camera is the fact that it's rocking a 1.04 million dot LCD screen on the back. And I just think it's crazy that Sony, out of all manufacturers, they haven't released a camera in several years in the APS-C lineup and they didn't update the back screen. I know this isn't a big deal for some people, but as a leader in the consumer electronics space and the imaging, cinematography, digital photography, and video space, I would just think that they would have decided, okay, this is the time to update that back LCD screen on our smaller bodies. Now, you could make the argument that the battery life probably would be drained a little bit more, or it would need more power to run it. I mean, it is using the Sony Z battery, but I still think they could have done just a couple of updates besides just including the 4K 120 and 4K 60. And that's great. I'm not complaining in that regard, but I just think that for $13.99, it probably could have had a couple more things. It's not the most impressive in terms of the body style. I mean, it's the same as they've mostly always had. There are a couple minor changes like the dial on the front. Yeah, I just don't find it that impressive. I can understand the benefit of it being just a real compact and capable video camera on the go. I'm not disputing that one bit. And I don't think it's a bad camera by any stretch. I just think that it's not that impressive, if that makes sense. But I wouldn't discourage anybody from getting it. I just think that Sony could have done more at the end of the day. It does also have the UVC, or I think it's the UEF live streaming feature, where you can plug in a cable directly into your computer and live stream without needing to connect through the HDMI capture card. Now, I don't know how robust that is as opposed to using an Elgato capture card or something similar. The camera obviously does have a very capable AI autofocusing system, similar to the Sony A7R5 and the Sony ZV-E1, and it's going to perform, I'm sure, exceptionally. I think that overall it will do just fine when it comes to any sort of autofocus tests and capabilities that the typical user would need. I think this camera overall probably should have been released last year or maybe even 18 months ago. I understand that there is a market for the APS-C line of cameras, and Sony does make a very compelling case for most people when looking at this range of cameras, because they have some great APS-C glass, like the 11mm f1.8, the 15mm. They also have the, I believe it's the 18-55 f2.8, which is the equivalent of like a 24-70 on full frame, but instead for APS-C. Sony makes some really good primes, and I think that that is obviously a reason that I would suggest the Sony A6700 over Canon R7, even though the Canon R7, I think, between these two cameras is the better camera, despite the fact that it doesn't have the 4K 120 in it. But you can get some great glass that are compact or more mid-range. I think some of the glass is, even smaller than like these Panasonic primes that I really like. This is the 18mm f1.8, but something like a Sony 20mm f1.8, which is really for full frame, that's probably about the Sony equivalent to this lens. I mean, that would be a great lens on the Sony A6700. It would probably be about 29 to 30 millimeter focal length, and that's something to consider too. They have great lenses in both their APS-C line and their full frame line. Canon doesn't really have a number of affordable and really great lenses for their APS-C line of RF cameras like Sony does. So that really determines, I guess, where you probably would want to go. You probably wouldn't want to look at the bodies solely. I will say that personally, I would prefer the R7 over the A6700. But once you look at the lenses are probably the more, I guess, deciding factor in determining which one you're going to go with. I think the A6700 is going to make anybody happy that hasn't had a Sony camera in the past several years or has never had a mirrorless camera, and this is their first one that they're jumping into. However, I do think that there are better options if you're willing to just pay a little bit more. I think you can get a better bang for your buck going with something like an FX30, or even considering the fact that the Panasonic S5 Mark II that I'm shooting with right now, I know it was $2,000 upon launch, but I bet there's probably already some open box models out there for $1,900. And if you can just save up a couple $100 more, I think the Panasonic S5 Mark II would be an even better option. Or going with, like I said, the Sony FX30. You could also look into the Fuji system too. I know Fuji just released the Fuji XS, I think it's the XS20, and I haven't really looked into that one too much, but I will take a look at some of the specs on that. I've heard some pretty positive things. However, I don't know about that fan being attached to the back of the camera. I personally would never do something like that, but I'll have to look more into that. However, that being said, overall, I think the Sony A6700 is a great camera. I just think that Sony could have done a little bit more or pushed the envelope a little bit more with this specific model. I think that the lack of dual SD card slots is a little bit of a detriment. Not that everybody needs that in this specific model, but the fact that it didn't have an updated back LCD screen And even just keeping the same kind of monotonous body style, I think they could have changed it a little bit. I know people are looking for more compact and portable solutions, but I think Sony could have updated it and made it a little bit better too. That being said, I really appreciate you guys checking out this video, and I'd love to know your thoughts on the Sony A6700. What did you think about the announcement? Did the specs align with what you were expecting? And would you consider picking one up if you were out there looking for a Sony APS-C style body? Anyway, I would love to know your thoughts, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one.